The night sky over England glowed faintly with the light of a half-moon, just enough illumination for Flight Lieutenant Thomas Wright to see the outlines of the other Lancaster bombers as they assembled in formation. It was July 24, 1943, and Operation Gomorrah was about to begin. The target, Hamburg, one of Nazi Germany's most vital industrial centers and port cities. But tonight would be different from all previous bombing missions. In Wright's aircraft, alongside the usual payload of explosives, sat wooden boxes filled with something that looked utterly insignificant. Bundles of aluminum strips, each about 30 centimeters long and a few centimeters wide. "Nervous, sir?" asked Flight Sergeant James Bennett, the navigator, noticing Wright's tense expression as they reached cruising altitude. "Not about the flak or fighters," Wright replied, tapping one of the boxes. "About whether this stuff will actually work." The stuff was codenamed Window. Millions of strips of black paper backed with aluminum foil, cut precisely to half the wavelength of German radar systems. In theory, when dispersed from aircraft, these strips would create thousands of false returns on enemy radar screens, making it impossible to distinguish real bombers from phantom echoes. If successful, it would blind the sophisticated German air defense system overnight. The concept wasn't new. German scientists had independently discovered the same principle and named it Duple. British scientists had found it too, but both sides had been reluctant to deploy it, fearing the enemy would copy the technique and use it against them. By mid-1943, however, with bomber losses mounting at an unsustainable rate, the Allied commanders finally decided the potential benefits outweighed the risks. As Wright's bomber approached the Dutch coast, the tension in the crew compartment was palpable. The German radar network had proven devastatingly effective, directing searchlights, anti-aircraft guns, and night fighters with deadly precision. Wright checked his watch, 20 minutes until they would deploy the Window for the first time in combat. In a darkened room at the Luftwaffe Control Center near Hamburg, Hauptmann Karl Weber stared intently at the greenish glow of his radar screen. He had been tracking the approaching bomber formation since it crossed the North Sea. Weber was one of Germany's most experienced radar operators, having guided night fighters to countless Allied bombers over the past 3 years. Contact confirmed. Approximately 140 bombers heading directly for Hamburg. Weber reported calmly to the night fighter controller beside him. "Fighters should intercept in 12 minutes. Suddenly, Weber's screen erupted with signals. Where moments before there had been a tight formation of radar returns, now there appeared to be hundreds, then thousands of aircraft, filling the entire screen with a blizzard of echoes. "What's happening?" demanded the controller, leaning over Weber's shoulder. Weber frantically adjusted his equipment, thinking it must be malfunctioning. "I don't know. It's as if the entire sky is filled with aircraft." "This is impossible!" Similar scenes were unfolding at every German radar station from the Dutch coast to Hamburg. The carefully orchestrated air defense system which had claimed so many Allied bombers was thrown into chaos. Searchlights swept the sky randomly. Anti-aircraft guns fired blindly. Most critically, the night fighters, deprived of ground guidance, circled helplessly, unable to locate their targets in the darkness. Back in Wright's Lancaster, Bennett was counting down the minutes since they had begun dropping the window strips. 20 minutes since deployment, sir. We should be well within range of their radar defenses by now." Wright nodded, scanning the dark horizon. "And not a single searchlight has found us. No flak bursts nearby." He allowed himself a small smile. "I think it's actually working." Below them, Hamburg lay exposed. For the first time in years, the RAF bombers approached their target virtually unopposed. The Pathfinder aircraft dropped their marker flares with unprecedented accuracy, and the main bomber force delivered their payloads with minimal evasive maneuvering. The result was devastating. Precision bombing that ignited one of the most destructive firestorms of the war. As Wright's aircraft turned for home, he looked back at the inferno that was once Hamburg, feeling a complex mixture of professional satisfaction and human regret. "We've changed the war tonight," he said quietly to Bennett. "For better or worse, nothing will be the same after this." In Berlin, the news of Hamburg's destruction reached Hitler's headquarters the following morning. The Führer's rage was apocalyptic. "How could this happen?" he shouted at Luftwaffe Chief Hermann Göring. "You assured me our air defenses were impenetrable." Göring, already falling from favor, had no adequate explanation. The technical officers struggled to explain the simple yet devastatingly effective countermeasure that had neutralized their entire radar network. Dr. Hans Fischer, one of Germany's leading radar experts, examined the aluminum strips that had been recovered from the bombing zone. "It's so elementary," he explained to the assembled officers. "Each strip resonates at the exact frequency of our radar, creating a return signal indistinguishable from an aircraft. With millions of these in the air, can we adjust our radar to filter them out?" demanded Goering. Fischer shook his head. "Not quickly. Eventually, perhaps, but by then..." He left the implication hanging. The RAF would exploit this advantage mercilessly in the coming weeks. Indeed, follow-up raids on Hamburg continued for a week, reducing much of the city to rubble. The window technique was deployed in every major bombing operation that followed. The Germans eventually developed countermeasures, but they never fully regained the effectiveness of their once formidable air defense system. In a modest laboratory at the Telecommunications Research Establishment in Malvern, England, Dr. Robert Watson-Watt reviewed the initial reports from the Hamburg raid. As one of the pioneers of British radar development, he had been skeptical about window, concerned about the potential for the Germans to use the same technique against British defenses. "It appears our concerns were unfounded," remarked his colleague. Dr. Joan Elizabeth, studying the extraordinarily low loss rates from the raid. "The Germans had discovered the principle years ago but never deployed it, just as we hadn't until now. They were caught in the same trap as us," Watson-Watt replied, afraid that using it would teach the enemy to do the same. "In the end, it was simply a matter of who would blink first," Elizabeth nodded. "And the consequences for Hamburg were catastrophic." Watson-Watt removed his glasses, suddenly looking tired. "This is the nature of scientific warfare. A simple application of basic physics has likely shortened this war by months, perhaps years. But at what cost to the civilians below?" On August 17, 1943, Flight Lieutenant Wright was summoned to the office of Air Vice Marshal Donald Bennett, no relation to Wright's navigator, commander of the Pathfinder Force. Wright stood at attention as Bennett reviewed the operational report. "At ease, Wright," Bennett said finally. "Your crew performed admirably during the Hamburg raids. Your detailed observations about the effectiveness of window have been particularly valuable." "Thank you, sir," Wright replied. "The difference was remarkable. Like night and day, if you'll pardon the expression." Bennett allowed himself a small smile. "Indeed, we're expanding the use of window to all bomber operations. However, we're already receiving intelligence that the Germans are working on countermeasures, radar systems operating on different frequencies, visual spotting networks, and the like." Wright nodded. "We expected as much, sir. It won't be a silver bullet forever." "No," Bennett agreed, "but it's given us a crucial advantage at a critical time. Now I have a new assignment for you. We're forming a special unit to develop new radar countermeasures as the Germans adapt. Given your experience with the first deployment of window, I want you to join this unit." For the remainder of the war, the technological battle continued. As the Germans developed new radar systems operating on different wavelengths, the British responded with new sizes of window strips. When the Germans introduced radar operators trained to distinguish between real aircraft and window, the British developed mechanical dispensers that released window in patterns mimicking bomber formations. By early 1944, an RAF bomber carried not just window, but a suite of electronic countermeasures: mandrel to jam early warning radar, airborne cigar to jam night fighter communications, and corona operators who would broadcast false instructions to German fighters in perfect German. In a bunker deep beneath Berlin in February 1944, as Allied bombs fell on the city above, a group of German scientists and officers conducted a post-mortem on the air defense failure. Dr. Fischer, now heading a special countermeasures unit, addressed the group. "Gentlemen, our mistake was not technical but psychological. We discovered Duppel, what the British call window, years before they deployed it. Our own scientists suppressed its use, fearing the enemy would adopt it against us." A Luftwaffe colonel interjected, "We were right to worry. Since they started using it, our own radar has been nearly useless against their bombing raids." Fischer nodded. "Indeed, but by not deploying it ourselves, we lost the opportunity to develop countermeasures before they used it against us. We were caught entirely unprepared. The lesson is clear: in technological warfare, The advantage often goes not to those who invent a weapon first, but to those who have the courage to use it first. As the war in Europe approached its conclusion in early 1945, Thomas Wright, now a wing commander, sat in the officers' mess at RAF Whiten, sharing a drink with his old navigator James Bennett, now a flight lieutenant. "Hard to believe it's been almost 2 years since that first Hamburg raid," Bennett remarked. "Sometimes I wonder how many lives were saved on our side by those strips of tinfoil," Wright nodded thoughtfully. "Thousands, certainly. And how many German lives might have been saved if they'd used their duple against us first? War is full of such ironies. The scientists are saying the principle will have applications long after the war," Bennett added. "Civilian radar, weather forecasting, even astronomy." "That's some comfort, I suppose," Wright replied. "That something developed for destruction might eventually serve more peaceful purposes." Outside, the distinctive roar of Merlin engines announced another bomber stream assembling for a night raid over Germany. The war wasn't over yet. In a quiet ceremony at the Air Ministry in London in November 1945, after the war had ended, a small group gathered to recognize the contributions of those who had developed Window. Among them was Joan Elizabeth, whose calculations had been crucial in determining the precise dimensions required for the aluminum strips to be effective. "It seems almost absurd in retrospect," she commented to a colleague, "that something as simple as strips of foil could have such a dramatic impact on the course of the war." "The most elegant solutions often are the simplest," her colleague replied. "Though I suspect future electronic warfare will become increasingly complex." Elizabeth smiled wryly. "No doubt. But I hope the fundamental lesson remains. Sometimes the most effective countermeasure isn't a bigger weapon, but a cleverer one." Decades later, retired Air Marshal Thomas Wright sat for an interview with a military historian researching the impact of electronic warfare in World War II. Window, or chaff as it's commonly known, today seems almost primitive compared to modern electronic countermeasures, the historian remarked. Wright smiled. "All technology eventually becomes obsolete. But the principle behind Window, using the physics of your enemy's own systems against them, that principle is timeless. Today's electronic warfare specialists are still following the same basic concept, just with infinitely more sophisticated tools." "Do you consider the development of Window to be your most significant contribution to the war effort?" the historian asked. Wright was silent for a moment. "It's not for me to judge, but I will say this. In warfare, it's rare that a single innovation changes the balance so dramatically overnight. For a brief period in 1943, we rendered useless a defensive system that had cost the Germans years of work and millions of Reichsmarks to build. And we did it with strips of tinfoil that cost pennies each." He paused. "There's a lesson in that, I think, about the nature of warfare, and perhaps about human ingenuity itself." As radar and electronic countermeasure technology continued to evolve throughout the Cold War and beyond, the legacy of Window chaff remained. Modern military aircraft still carry chaff dispensers as a last line of defense. The simple aluminum strips have been refined into sophisticated cartridges containing millions of precisely engineered fibers, but the basic principle remains unchanged nearly 80 years after that first historic raid on Hamburg. The technological battle between radar and countermeasures that began over the skies of Germany continues to this day. An endless cycle of measure and countermeasure, action and reaction, a testament to both the destructive and creative aspects of human innovation in times of conflict. The legacy of Window extended far beyond World War II, transforming electronic warfare forever. In the immediate aftermath of the conflict, both the United States and Soviet Union rushed to collect German radar technology, along with the countermeasures developed in response to Window. Operation Paperclip and its Soviet equivalent brought German scientists to work for the former Allies, now emerging as Cold War adversaries. By the Korean War in the early 1950s, chaff deployment had become standard doctrine for both sides. When American B-29 bombers conducted raids over North Korea, they routinely dispensed chaff to confuse the Soviet-supplied radar systems. The aluminum strips floated down through the cold Asian skies just as they had over Europe, though now they were cut to counter different radar wavelengths. Lieutenant Colonel Harold Richards, who had served as a young radar technician during the Hamburg raids, now headed an electronic countermeasures unit supporting the Far East Air Forces. In a bunker near Seoul in 1952, He briefed pilots on the latest refinements. "The principle remains the same, gentlemen," Richards explained, displaying a handful of the metallic strips. "But the execution has improved considerably. These newer chaff bundles disperse more efficiently and stay aloft longer. The dispensers are automated now. No more crewmen pushing boxes out of aircraft by hand." A young pilot raised his hand. "I heard the Soviets are developing radar that can distinguish between chaff and actual aircraft. Is that true, sir?" Richards nodded grimly. "The technical race never ends. They've developed pulse Doppler radar that can detect the movement difference between a bomber and floating chaff. Which is why we've developed these." He held up another device. "We call them rope, longer. Chaff fibers specifically designed to mimic the radar cross-section and movement characteristics of an aircraft. This continuous cycle of innovation and counter-innovation accelerated throughout the Cold War. The AD, U.S. Strategic Air Command's B-52 bombers, designed to penetrate Soviet airspace in the event of nuclear war, carried increasingly sophisticated electronic warfare suites, with chaff as just one component in a complex array of jamming and deception systems. In a classified facility at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in 1962, Dr. Eleanor Westfield, one of the few women in the male-dominated field of electronic warfare, led a team developing the next generation of radar countermeasures. Her connection to Window went back to her days as a junior researcher working alongside Joan Elizabeth at TRE Malvern during the war. "The fundamental physical principles haven't changed," she explained to a visiting Air Force general, "but the application has become exponentially more sophisticated." Early Window was like shouting to create an echo. "What we're developing now is more akin to ventriloquism, making the radar hear voices from places where nothing exists." The laboratory behind her hummed with activity as technicians tested various compositions of chaff, seeking materials that would respond precisely to specific radar frequencies while remaining lightweight enough to float for extended periods. "The latest Soviet early warning radars operate across multiple frequency bands simultaneously," Westfield continued. "So we've developed multi-cut chaff with fibers of different lengths mixed in precisely calculated ratios." The general nodded. "And how effective is it?" "In our latest tests, a single B-52 dispensing our new chaff appeared as an entire bomber wing on Soviet-type radar. Combine that with our electronic jammers and decoys, and we create a very confusing picture indeed." Vietnam provided the next major battlefield test for chaff technology. Operation Linebacker II in December 1972 saw American B-52s facing sophisticated Soviet-supplied surface-to-air missile systems around Hanoi and Haiphong. The electronic warfare officers aboard these bombers deployed chaff corridors, massive clouds of metallized strips that created a protective pathway through which the bombing formations could fly. Captain Daniel Westmoreland, an electronic warfare officer on a B-52D, recalled the tense moments as they approached the heavily defended North Vietnamese capital. "We began dispensing chaff about 50 miles out, creating a corridor roughly 5 miles wide. On radar, it would have looked like a solid wall of bombers, making it nearly impossible for the Vietnamese operators to distinguish our actual aircraft within the cloud. Despite these measures, several B-52s were lost to surface-to-air missiles during the operation, demonstrating that while chaff remained effective, it was no longer the near-perfect defense it had been during those first Hamburg raids. The technological evolution continued through the decades. By the 1980s, chaff had evolved to include tiny fibers coated with radar-absorbing materials, designed to counter specific threat systems. The fibers themselves were now made of specialized composites rather than simple aluminum, some incorporating fiberglass cores for improved aerodynamic properties, others using metallized nylon that would disperse in complex, unpredictable patterns. During the 1991 Gulf War, the first night of Operation Desert Storm saw American and coalition aircraft dropping chaff in unprecedented quantities. Iraqi radar operators, trained on Soviet doctrine, found their screens filled with confusing returns as Tomahawk cruise missiles and stealth aircraft slipped through the gaps in their coverage. Colonel Thomas Wright III, grandson of the original Window pioneer, commanded an electronic warfare squadron during the conflict. In a secure briefing room at a Saudi Arabian airbase, he explained the strategy to his pilots. "Our advantage isn't just technological," he told them, "it's psychological. The Iraqi operators know their systems are being fooled, but they can't distinguish between real threats and ghost returns. The uncertainty paralyzes their decision-making process. One of the pilots frowned. Isn't that exactly what happened to the Germans in '43 when your grandfather dropped the first window? Wright nodded. The more things change, the more they stay the same. The physics hasn't changed, just the application. Though I doubt my grandfather would recognize what we're using now. Indeed, by the 1990s, modern Chaff cartridges contained millions of precisely engineered fibers, each cut to respond to specific radar wavelengths. When dispensed, they created three-dimensional radar reflective clouds that could be shaped to mimic various aircraft signatures or to obscure entire formations. Back in England, the elderly Sir Thomas Wright, knighted for his service and contributions to aviation, visited the Royal Air Force Museum in Hendon, where a display had been erected commemorating the window innovation. Accompanied by his grandson during a leave from Gulf War duties, he examined the simple strips of foil behind glass, comparing them to a modern Chaff cartridge also on display. Remarkable how something so simple could have such an impact, the younger Wright commented. The elder Wright shook his head. It wasn't the technology that was remarkable. It was the timing and the decision to use it. The Germans had the same capability but hesitated. In warfare, sometimes the advantage goes not to those with superior technology, but to those willing to deploy what they have at the decisive moment. As the information age dawned, Chaff continued to adapt. By the early 2000s, digital Chaff, electronic signals designed to confuse computerized radar systems, began supplementing physical countermeasures. Yet even the most advanced aircraft, including stealth bombers and fighters with their radar-absorbent materials, still carried physical Chaff dispensers as a last line of defense. Dr. Ananya Patel, a radar engineer at MIT's Lincoln Laboratory in 2010, led research into the future of electronic countermeasures. In a paper presented to a classified defense symposium, she outlined the continuing relevance of Chaff-based concepts. The principles first demonstrated by Window in 1943 remain fundamental to modern electronic warfare. Her presentation began. While we've developed increasingly sophisticated active jamming systems, the passive physical disruption of radar returns still offers unique advantages that cannot be fully replicated electronically. Her research focused on microscale Chaff, metallized carbon, nanotubes that could remain airborne for hours while providing precise radar returns across multiple frequency bands. The technology was a far cry from the hand-cut strips dropped over Hamburg, but the underlying concept remained unchanged. In Ukraine in 2022, Russian and Ukrainian forces both employed advanced Chaff systems as part of their electronic warfare strategies. Ukrainian Mi-24 helicopter pilots, facing Russian air defense systems, relied heavily on Chaff dispensers when conducting close air support missions. The metallized clouds momentarily blinded missile guidance systems, creating precious seconds for evasive maneuvers. Colonel Volodymyr Kovalenko, commanding a Ukrainian electronic warfare unit, explained to his international advisors, "We've studied the history of Window from your textbooks. 80 years later, and still we rely on pieces of metal confusing radar. Some principles of warfare never change." At the Royal United Services Institute in London that same year, a conference on the history of electronic warfare brought together military historians and active service personnel. A panel discussion on Window, the first electronic warfare revolution, drew particular interest. Air Vice Marshal Helena Chambers, head of the RAF's Electronic Warfare Directorate, summarized the legacy. What made Window so revolutionary wasn't the technology itself. It was almost embarrassingly simple. What made it revolutionary was that it exploited a fundamental vulnerability in the enemy's most advanced defensive system. It's a lesson we constantly relearn. Sometimes the most effective countermeasure isn't matching complexity with complexity, but finding the simple weakness in a complex system. In the audience, 98-year-old Dame Joan Elizabeth, the last surviving member of the original Window development team, listened with satisfaction. After the panel, a young electronic warfare officer approached her for an autograph. "It's an honor to meet you, ma'am," the officer said. "Your work saved countless lives," Elizabeth smiled wryly. "At the time, we were just trying to solve a problem with the tools we had available. We never imagined the legacy would continue this long," Do you think there will ever be a radar system that can't be fooled by some version of chaff? The young officer asked. Elizabeth considered this. Science advances, but physics remains constant. As long as radar relies on the reflection of electromagnetic waves, there will always be ways to create false reflections. The forms may change, but the fundamental principles will remain. By 2025, with increasing concern about electronic warfare and potential near-peer conflicts, research into countermeasures had once again become a priority. At the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA, Project Chameleon explored adaptive chaff systems that could change their reflective properties in flight to counter the most advanced tracking radars. Dr. Marcus Chen, the project lead, explained to a congressional oversight committee, modern radar systems use artificial intelligence to distinguish between decoys and actual targets. Our response is to make the decoys themselves intelligent, chaff that can adapt its signature in real time to continue presenting as a credible target. One congressman raised an eyebrow. So we're talking about smart tinfoil now? Chen smiled. In essence, yes. Though I prefer to think of it as the natural evolution of a concept that began with those simple strips, dropped over Hamburg in 1943 in the skies above the Pacific during a multinational naval exercise. American F-35s and Chinese J-20s simultaneously released chaff clouds as they conducted simulated intercepts. Despite the 8 decades of technological advancement since Windows' first deployment, both aircraft relied on the same fundamental physical principle to confuse the other's radar. On the deck of the USS Nimitz, Admiral Sarah Donovan observed the exercise through binoculars. Billions of dollars of stealth technology on both sides, she remarked to her staff, and they still resort to throwing out clouds of metal strips when things get tight. Her electronic warfare officer nodded. There's something almost poetic about it, ma'am. The most advanced fighters in the world, still using a technique pioneered by bomber crews in the Second World War. It's a reminder, Donovan replied, that for all our technological advancement, warfare often comes down to exploiting the unchangeable laws of physics. In a special collection at the Imperial War Museum in London, an archivist carefully preserved the original operational plans for the first window deployment. The yellowed papers, alongside samples of the original foil strips, represented a pivotal moment in military history, a point where a simple innovation had changed the course of a war overnight. Dr. Nathaniel Wright, great-grandson of Thomas Wright and a military historian specializing in technological turning points, often brought his students to see these artifacts. On one such visit, he explained their significance to a group of cadets from the Royal Air Force College Cranwell. What you're looking at is more than just historical curiosity, he told them. It's a lesson in innovative thinking. The Germans and British had both discovered the principle years earlier, but it was the decision to finally deploy it, despite the risks, that changed the strategic balance. A cadet raised her hand. But couldn't the Germans have immediately used the same technique against British radar? They did eventually, Wright acknowledged. But by then, the Allies had already prepared countermeasures. The advantage goes to the side that acts decisively with the technology they have, not the side that waits for perfection. As the cadets moved on to other exhibits, Wright remained behind, gazing at his great-grandfather's signature on one of the operational orders. The simple innovation of window had saved countless Allied airmen, though at a terrible cost to those on the ground in German cities. Like so many wartime technological breakthroughs, its legacy was morally complex, a life-saving defensive measure for some, a harbinger of destruction for others. In the continuing evolution of electronic warfare, window represented more than just a technical milestone. It embodied a fundamental truth about conflict, that sometimes the most effective response to an adversary's technological advantage isn't to match it directly, but to find and exploit its inherent vulnerabilities. It was a lesson that military planners, scientists, and strategists continued to relearn in conflicts across the decades and around the world. And in the skies above contested regions, clouds of chaff, evolved but recognizable descendants of those first crude foil strips, still bloomed like strange metallic flowers, creating phantom echoes to confuse and misdirect, physical embodiments of the endless battle between measure and countermeasure that defines modern warfare. At a NATO electronic warfare exercise in northern Norway in 2026, aircraft from a dozen nations deployed various countermeasures against simulated air defense networks. Despite the presence of advanced digital jamming systems, laser dazzlers, and cyber attack capabilities, Chaff remained a core component of their defensive suites. Wing Commander Adya Patel, an electronic warfare specialist with the RAF, explained to observers, Chaff persists because of its reliability. Electronic jammers can be countered electronically, cyber attacks can be blocked, but Chaff exploits the fundamental physics of radar. It creates actual returns that must be processed. Even the most advanced AI-driven targeting systems must deal with the noise it generates. The exercise demonstrated that modern Chaff deployment had become an art form. Aircraft no longer simply expelled clouds of material. They created carefully shaped patterns designed to present specific signatures to enemy radar. Some dispensers could lay down corridors of chaff with varying densities to create the illusion of multiple aircraft flying in formation. Others could release material timed to simulate the radar cross-section of a much larger platform. In defense laboratories across the world, the descendants of Window continued to evolve. Russian engineers developed chaff incorporating carbon nanotubes that could remain airborne for extended periods. American researchers experimented with plasma-based systems that could create temporary radar reflective fields without physical materials. Chinese scientists worked on biodegradable chaff that would leave no environmental trace after use. Yet for all these advancements, the basic principle remained unchanged from that first deployment over Hamburg in 1943. When radar waves encountered a reflective surface tuned to their specific wavelength, they bounced back to create a return signal indistinguishable from a genuine target. The story of Window had become standard curriculum at military academies worldwide, not just for its technical significance but for its strategic lesson about innovation and decision-making in warfare. At the United States Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs, cadets studied the Hamburg raids as a case study in transformative tactics. Colonel Jennifer Harris, teaching military history, emphasized this point to her class. The RAF had window capability for nearly 2 years before they used it. Think about that. For 2 years, they watched bomber crews die while holding back a technology that could have saved them. It wasn't technical limitations that caused this delay. It was strategic hesitation. The fear that using Window would teach the Germans to do the same against British defenses. A cadet raised his hand. But wasn't that a legitimate concern, ma'am? Harris nodded. Absolutely. When the Germans did eventually use Duppel against British radar, it reduced the effectiveness of the UK's air defenses. But by then, the strategic situation had changed. The Allied bombing offensive had already damaged German industrial capacity, and air superiority was shifting. The lesson isn't that they should have used Window earlier without considering the consequences. The lesson is about understanding when the immediate tactical advantage outweighs the long-term strategic risk. In retirement homes across Britain, the last few surviving Lancaster bomber crew members who had participated in those first Window-equipped raids occasionally gathered for reunions. Their numbers dwindled with each passing year, but their stories remained powerful testimonials to a turning point in the air war. Former flight engineer William Bill Harrison, 101 years old in 2027, recalled the night of July 24, 1943, to his great-grandchildren during a family gathering. We had no idea if it would work, you see. We'd been told it would confuse their radar, but we'd heard all sorts of promises before about new technologies that were supposed to protect us. But that night was different. We flew over areas where we'd previously faced intense flak and searchlights, and there was nothing, just occasional wild firing into empty sky. It felt like we'd suddenly become invisible. The technological principles pioneered by Window found applications far beyond warfare. Weather forecasters used chaff-like materials to track storm systems. Astronomers deployed metallized clouds to create artificial meteors for studying the upper atmosphere. Conservation biologists used radar reflective markers to track bird migrations. Dr. Emma Richardson, addressing a conference on dual-use technologies in 2028, highlighted this evolution. What began as a tool of war has found numerous peaceful applications. This is often the case with military innovations. Their principles are eventually repurposed to serve life rather than threaten it. Yet, in global hotspots and aboard military aircraft worldwide, the martial application of Window's descendants continued. Modern fighter pilots still train to deploy chaff as part of their defensive maneuvers. Electronic warfare officers still calculated the optimal dispersion patterns to counter specific threat systems. Military scientists still sought new materials and methods to enhance Chaff's effectiveness against ever more sophisticated radar. In his final interview before his death in 2030, Air Marshal Sir Thomas Wright reflected on the legacy of the innovation he had helped to deploy nearly 9 decades earlier. Window wasn't just a tactical tool, it became a metaphor for a certain kind of thinking in warfare. It taught us that sometimes the most effective way to defeat a complex system isn't to destroy it physically, but to confuse it, to make it see things that aren't there, to make it waste its resources chasing ghosts. The interviewer nodded. And that principle extends beyond radar countermeasures. Precisely, Wright agreed. Whether it's radar or sonar or infrared or any sensing technology, or even human intelligence networks, the principle of creating false positives, of generating noise that obscures the signal, remains a fundamental concept in modern warfare. Wright paused, his eyes distant as he recalled those dangerous nights over Germany. We didn't think in such abstract terms back then, of course. We were just young men trying to survive. But sometimes the most profound innovations come from that most basic human instinct, the drive to stay alive against the odds. As military technology continued its relentless advance, with hypersonic missiles, quantum radar, and artificial intelligence transforming the battlefield, the legacy of Window endured. In its elegant simplicity, strips of metal cut to precise lengths to resonate at specific frequencies, it embodied a timeless principle of warfare, that sometimes the most effective countermeasure isn't to meet force with force, but to exploit the fundamental limitations of an adversary's systems. And in the endless cycle of measure and countermeasure that defines technological conflict, Window stands as a reminder that innovation isn't always about creating something entirely new. Sometimes it's about finding a new application for something simple, deploying it at precisely the right moment, and changing the rules of the game overnight. In a cavernous hangar at Nellis Air Force Base in 2032, engineers and pilots gathered around a prototype aircraft designed specifically for electronic warfare. The EA-18G Growler II represented the latest evolution in the decades-long battle between radar and countermeasures. Lieutenant Commander Sofia Rodriguez, the test pilot assigned to evaluate its capabilities, ran her hand along the sleek fuselage. The difference from the original Growlers is incredible, she remarked to Chief Engineer Dr. Raj Patel. But I notice you've still included traditional chaff dispensers alongside all the advanced electronic systems. Patel nodded. Some principles never become obsolete. The Russians and Chinese have developed quantum radar systems that can potentially see through electronic jamming. But physical chaff, especially our new metamaterial variants, still creates genuine radar. Returns that even quantum systems must process. The new chaff, used in the Growler II, bore little physical resemblance to the aluminum strips, dropped over Hamburg nearly 90 years earlier. Each microscopic fiber contained embedded circuitry that could actively shift its radar cross-section, creating dynamic patterns that were extraordinarily difficult for automated targeting systems to filter out. Some fibers incorporated miniature power sources that allowed them to maintain specific resonance patterns for hours rather than minutes. The principle remains the same, Patel continued. Opening a compartment to reveal rows of advanced chaff cartridges. Create false returns to confuse enemy sensors. But the execution has evolved beyond anything those RAF crews could have imagined. Rodriguez smiled. My great-grandfather was a radar operator during the Korean War. He used to tell stories about the first generation of chaff they encountered. Said it was like trying to find a needle in a stack of needles, and now we're giving you a stack of smart moving needles, Patel replied. Technology evolves, but physics remains constant. In Moscow that same year, at the Central Research Institute of the Russian Aerospace Forces, Colonel Dmitry Volkov led a team developing countermeasures to Western chaff systems. The work was challenging. Each new generation of NATO chaff seemed designed specifically to defeat their previous countermeasures. The Americans and their allies have returned to an old principle, Volkov explained to a visiting general. Rather than trying to make their aircraft invisible to radar, which has proven increasingly difficult against our latest systems, they are making them indistinguishable from hundreds of false targets. He displayed a simulation showing how the latest Western chaff created patterns that precisely mimicked actual aircraft signatures. complete with Doppler shifts that suggested movement. It's no longer sufficient to distinguish moving targets from stationary chaff. Volkov continued. Now we must determine which moving targets are genuine and which are sophisticated decoys. The general frowned. And your solution? Multi-spectrum integration, Volkov replied, switching to another display. No single sensor type can reliably distinguish real aircraft from modern chaff. But by combining radar with infrared, electromagnetic, and optical sensing, we can identify inconsistencies. A chaff cloud might perfectly mimic an aircraft's radar signature, but it cannot simultaneously reproduce its heat signature, electromagnetic emissions, and visual profile. The technological race continued, with neither side gaining a decisive advantage for long. For every new countermeasure, a countermeasure emerged. The descendants of Window had become just one element in an increasingly complex electronic battlefield. At the British Defence Science and Technology Laboratory at Porton Down in 2035, Dr. Eliza Wright, great-great-granddaughter of Thomas Wright, continued the family tradition, leading research into advanced countermeasures. A framed photograph of her ancestor hung on her office wall alongside a preserved sample of original window material. There's something poetic about it, she told a colleague as they reviewed test results from their latest chaff variant. 5 generations of my family have been involved in essentially the same task, finding new ways to confuse enemy radar. Her colleague, Dr. Hassan Ibrahim, nodded thoughtfully. It's remarkable how enduring the basic concept is proven. When we launched our satellite-based chaff deployment system last year, I realized we're still fundamentally doing what your great-great-grandfather did, just from orbit instead of a bomber. The satellite system represented a significant evolution in chaff technology. Rather than requiring aircraft to deploy countermeasures directly, specialized satellites could dispense clouds of advanced chaff materials into precise atmospheric layers, creating defensive screens over vast areas. The system had proven particularly valuable for protecting naval task forces from over-the-horizon missile attacks. He would have been amazed by the technology, Wright agreed, but I think he'd recognize the underlying principle immediately. Ibrahim gestured to the test results on their screens. The latest Chinese phased array radars are showing some ability to distinguish our standard chaff from actual targets. We may need to accelerate deployment of the adaptive variants, Wright sighed. And so the cycle continues. In international airspace over the Baltic Sea in 2037, a tense encounter between NATO and Russian aircraft demonstrated that chaff remained an essential element of aerial combat. When Russian Su-57s approached too close to a NATO maritime patrol mission, Polish F-35s moved to intercept. As the aircraft maneuvered in close proximity, both sides deployed chaff defensively, creating a shimmering metallic cloud visible even to the naked eye. Captain Marek Kowalski, one of the Polish pilots, later described the encounter. We were tracking their targeting radars painting us, so we deployed countermeasures as a precaution. They responded in kind. For a few minutes, we were all flying through this dense cloud of advanced chaff, both sides essentially blind to precision targeting but aware of each other's general position. The incident ended without escalation, but it highlighted how chaff had evolved from an offensive bombing tool to an essential defensive system that helped prevent accidental engagements by reducing targeting precision in tense situations. At the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London, analysts noted this evolution in a 2038 report on aerial deconfliction technologies. The descendants of Window now serve a dual purpose in contested airspace. They not only protect aircraft from attack, but also create a form of strategic ambiguity that can prevent accidental escalation. When precise targeting becomes temporarily impossible, it forces both sides to rely on visual identification and direct communication, reducing the risk of automated or hasty responses. As environmental concerns grew more prominent in the 2040s, military forces worldwide began transitioning to biodegradable chaff materials. The traditional aluminum fibers, which could persist in the environment for decades, were gradually replaced with metallized organic compounds designed to break down naturally within weeks of deployment. Commander Wei Chen of the People's Liberation Army Air Force, addressing an international military environmental conference in 2042, explained her country's approach. Our new biomimetic chaff is based on metallized spider silk proteins that provide excellent radar reflection properties while decomposing naturally after exposure to ultraviolet light. The material returns completely to the ecosystem within 30 days of deployment. Similar innovations appeared across all major military powers, addressing a growing concern about the environmental impact of chaff training and deployments. Some nations experimented with chaff made from conductive materials derived from agricultural waste, while others developed synthetic compounds specifically engineered for both performance and biodegradability. The civilian applications of chaff technology also continued to expand. In 2045, during the worst hurricane season on record, weather modification agencies deployed specialized chaff from aircraft to seed storm clouds, using precisely tuned materials to influence precipitation patterns and potentially reduce storm intensity. Dr. Isabella Martinez, director of the Global Weather Modification Initiative, explained the approach to an emergency session of the United Nations. We've adapted military chaff technology to create dispersal patterns that can help modify moisture condensation in severe storm systems. Early tests suggest we may be able to reduce hurricane wind speeds by as much as 15% in some cases. The technology remained controversial, with concerns about unintended consequences and jurisdictional questions about who had authority to modify weather systems that crossed international boundaries. But like many military innovations before it, the principles behind Window continued finding new applications and addressing civilian challenges. In military museums around the world, exhibits on electronic warfare inevitably featured Window as the foundation of modern radar countermeasures. At the National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C., a special exhibition in 2047 commemorated the centennial of electronic warfare, tracing its evolution from those first crude strips of metallized paper to the advanced metamaterials and satellite-deployed systems of the modern era. Dr. Jonathan Reynolds, the exhibition curator, guided special guests through the display. What makes the Window story so compelling is not just its technical significance but its human dimension. The decision to deploy it represented a crucial strategic choice, sacrificing a long-term secret for immediate tactical advantage. It's a case study in the moral and strategic complexity of warfare. The exhibition included recently declassified information about the development of chaff technology through the decades, including details about how close several Cold War confrontations had come to escalation were it not for the uncertainty created by chaff deployments during tense aerial encounters. In a specially designed interactive display, visitors could experience the perspective of a radar operator suddenly confronted with a screen full of Window returns, a vivid demonstration of the confusion and uncertainty the technology created. For many, it provided a new understanding of how a seemingly simple innovation had transformed modern warfare. As quantum computing advanced in the 2050s, it enabled new approaches to the age-old problem of distinguishing genuine targets from chaff. Quantum radar systems could theoretically detect the quantum entanglement signatures of objects, potentially allowing them to ignore chaff entirely. But as had happened countless times before, countermeasure technology evolved in response. At DARPA's Quantum Countermeasures Laboratory in 2053, Dr. Kwame Osi led development of quantum chaff, materials that could generate entangled photons matching those of actual aircraft. Every time a new sensing technology emerges, we find ways to confuse it, Osi explained during a classified briefing. Quantum radar was supposed to be the system that finally defeated chaff. Instead, we've developed chaff that speaks quantum. The theoretical cat-and-mouse game between radar and countermeasures had now extended into the quantum realm, with massive computing resources dedicated to creating and detecting ever more sophisticated deception patterns. Yet alongside these advanced systems, conventional chaff remained in use, a testament to the enduring value of its fundamental principle. During a brief but intense regional conflict in Southeast Asia in 2055, both sides deployed the full spectrum of electronic warfare capabilities, from the latest quantum systems to traditional chaff. Post-conflict analysis by neutral observers noted that despite billions spent on advanced technologies, basic chaff deployments had proven remarkably effective at neutralizing precision guidance systems. Admiral Yoshiro Tanaka of the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force, who had observed the conflict as part of an international monitoring team, reported to the UN Security Council. The most sophisticated sensors can be defeated by creating sufficient confusion. This has been true since 1943, and it remains true today. What we witnessed was not the failure of advanced technology, but confirmation of an enduring principle of electronic warfare. In the aftermath, military planners worldwide reassessed their electronic warfare doctrines, many choosing to maintain or even expand their investment in advanced Chaff systems alongside newer technologies. The simplicity, reliability, and proven effectiveness of physical radar countermeasures ensured their continued relevance even as warfare extended into new domains. At Oxford University in 2057, a symposium on enduring innovations in warfare brought together historians, military theorists, and veterans from conflicts spanning decades. A panel discussion on Window drew particular interest, examining how a single innovation had spawned a technological lineage spanning more than a century. Professor Yuki Nakamura, a military historian specializing in technological turning points, summarized the Window legacy. What makes Window significant isn't just its immediate impact on the bombing campaign against Germany, but how it established a fundamental approach to electronic warfare that remains relevant today. It demonstrated that sometimes the most effective response to a technological advantage isn't to match it directly, but to exploit its inherent vulnerabilities. A veteran electronic warfare officer in the audience raised his hand. "I deployed Chaff over the Persian Gulf, the South China Sea, and the Baltic during my career. The technology evolved dramatically, but the basic principle never changed: create sufficient ambiguity to deny the enemy certainty. It's remarkable how an innovation from the propeller age remained relevant into the quantum era." Nakamura nodded. "And that's precisely what makes Window one of the most significant military innovations of the modern era." Few technologies maintain their relevance across such vastly different technological contexts. As the symposium continued, participants noted that Window represented more than just a technical innovation. It embodied a philosophical approach to warfare that emphasized deception over destruction, confusion over confrontation. This approach had influenced military thinking far beyond the specific domain of radar countermeasures, shaping broader concepts of information warfare and strategic ambiguity. By 2060, as the centennial of Operation Gomorrah approached, the legacy of Window had extended in ways its creators could never have imagined. The physical descendants of those simple foil strips had evolved into sophisticated materials that could be deployed from platforms ranging from hypersonic aircraft to orbital systems. The conceptual descendants had influenced everything from cyber warfare to diplomatic strategy. At a retirement ceremony for General Eliza Wright, now ending her distinguished career at the British Royal Air Force, the Chief of the Defense Staff reflected on her family's unique connection to this technological lineage. The Wright family has been involved with Chaff technology for 5 generations now, from its first deployment over Hamburg to the quantum Chaff systems of today. It's a remarkable thread running through our defense history. Wright, in her response, held up a small case containing both an original window strip from her great-great-grandfather's era and a sample of the latest quantum Chaff material. "My ancestor could never have imagined how his wartime innovation would evolve," she said. "But I think he would recognize the underlying principle immediately. In warfare, sometimes the simplest solutions prove the most enduring. In museums, military academies, and defense laboratories around the world, the story of Window continued to be studied, not just for its historical significance, but for the timeless lessons it offered about innovation, decision-making, and the fundamental principles of technological warfare. Its legacy lived on in every radar countermeasure deployed, in every electronic warfare strategy developed, and in the continuing battle between detection and deception that defined modern conflict. And somewhere in the vast archives of the Imperial War Museum, the original operational orders for that first Window deployment over Hamburg remained preserved, a yellowing document that had changed the course of a war and established a principle of electronic warfare that would endure for more than a century, and likely beyond. As an elderly museum visitor examined this document in 2063, she turned to her grandchild and remarked, "It's hard to believe something as simple as strips of aluminum foil could have such an impact." The museum guide, overhearing this, smiled. That's precisely what makes the Window story so compelling. It reminds us that sometimes the most transformative innovations aren't the most complex or expensive, but the ones that identify and exploit a fundamental weakness in an adversary's system. The visitor nodded thoughtfully. "And I suppose that principle extends beyond warfare." "Indeed," the guide agreed. "Which is why Window isn't just military history. It's a case study in innovation that continues to influence fields from cybersecurity to market competition to political strategy. Whenever we face a seemingly insurmountable technological advantage, the lesson of Window reminds us to look not for direct confrontation, but for the inherent vulnerabilities that can be exploited with simpler means. As humanity continued to advance technologically, extending its reach beyond Earth and developing ever more sophisticated systems for both peace and war, the legacy of Window persisted, a reminder that sometimes the most effective response to complexity isn't greater complexity, but cleverly applied simplicity. And in the endless cycle of measure and countermeasure that defined technological conflict, this lesson would likely remain relevant for generations to come. In the skies above distant worlds, as humanity expanded into the solar system, the descendants of those simple foil strips would continue creating phantom echoes and false returns, exploiting the unchangeable laws of physics to confuse and misdirect, a lineage of deception extending from a summer night over Hamburg in 1943 into humanity's interplanetary future. By 2075, as humanity established permanent settlements on Mars and the Moon, the principles pioneered by Window found new applications in the unique environment of space. The vacuum between worlds presented new challenges and opportunities for radar and its countermeasures, extending the century-old technological race into a new frontier. Colonel Maya Wright Chen, the sixth generation of her family to work in electronic countermeasures, and now commanding the Earth Defense Force's Counterspace Division, supervised testing of the latest orbital Chaff deployment system from a control center in Lunar Base Armstrong. "Deploy Test Package Alpha," she ordered, watching as a small satellite in Earth orbit released a cloud of advanced metamaterial particles designed to confuse planetary defense radars. Her second-in-command, Major Julian Rodriguez, monitored the sensor readings. Dispersion pattern optimal. Earth tracking stations are reporting multiple false signatures appearing in high orbit. Wright Chen nodded with satisfaction. "My ancestors used aluminum foil to confuse German radar operators. We're using programmable matter to confuse automated defense systems. Different technology, same principle." In this era, Chaff had evolved far beyond simple reflective materials. The microscopic particles now contained quantum circuitry that could be remotely programmed to mimic specific spacecraft signatures or create phantom fleet formations. Some variants could even self-organize into distributed networks, creating persistent deception patterns that were extraordinarily difficult to distinguish from actual spacecraft. The strategic context had also evolved. With both Earth and Mars possessing kinetic orbital weapons, the risk of misidentification or automated response had become a serious concern. Advanced Chaff systems now served as much to prevent accidental escalation as to provide tactical advantage, creating deliberate ambiguity that forced decision-makers to rely on multiple verification methods before authorizing strikes. At the Mars Defense Force headquarters in Olympus City in 2078, Commander Adebayo Okafor addressed an emergency session of the Planetary Council after a concerning incident in orbit around Phobos. An unidentified Earth vessel deployed what appears to be a new form of metamaterial chaff near our early warning sensors, Okafor explained, displaying imagery of the shimmering cloud. It created what initially appeared to be multiple inbound objects on a collision course with our orbital infrastructure. Council Chair Dr. Lin Wei frowned. "Was this a deliberate provocation?" "We don't believe so," Okafor replied. "Our analysis suggests it was a test of their defensive capabilities that drifted further than intended. However, it demonstrates the potential for misinterpretation in an environment where response times are measured in minutes." The incident led to the Mars-Earth Protocol of 2079, establishing notification requirements for chaff tests and deployment zones where countermeasures could not be used. The treaty represented the extension of arms control principles into space, acknowledging the destabilizing potential of advanced deception technologies. Meanwhile, on Earth, the civilian applications of Windows descendants continued to expand. By 2080, climate engineering programs routinely deployed specialized chaff from high-altitude platforms to manage solar radiation reaching the planet's surface, helping to mitigate the effects of climate change. Dr. Alejandro Suarez, addressing the Global Climate Stabilization Conference, explained the approach. "Our stratospheric chaff doesn't just reflect radar, it selectively reflects specific wavelengths of solar radiation, while allowing others to pass through. It's essentially a programmable atmospheric filter that helps us precisely manage Earth's energy balance. The technology had become an essential component of humanity's response to environmental challenges, demonstrating how a wartime innovation could ultimately serve to protect rather than harm. In the asteroid belt, mining corporations deployed window-derived technologies for entirely different purposes. Radar reflective clouds helped mappers identify valuable deposits by analyzing how the signals scattered when they encountered different mineral compositions. The same physical principles that had once confused German radar operators now helped resource prospectors find platinum, rare earths, and water ice in the fragments of a failed planet. Dr. Hiroko Tanaka, chief scientist for the Ceres Mining Consortium, published a paper in 2085 titled From Window to Prospector: The Evolution of Chaff-Based Sensing Technologies. In it, she traced the lineage from wartime countermeasures to sophisticated resource detection systems. What began as a tool to create confusion has evolved into a means of creating clarity. By analyzing how our deployed particles interact with radar signals, we can now see beneath the surface of asteroids with unprecedented detail. The publication coincided with the opening of a special exhibition at the Smithsonian Museum of Space History. From Earth to the Stars: The Legacy of Electronic Warfare in Space. Exploration. The centerpiece featured an original sample of window material alongside examples of each generation of chaff technology that followed, extending to the programmable metamaterials now used throughout the solar system. The exhibition catalog noted, "Few technologies can trace such a direct lineage across more than 140 years, evolving from strips of metallized paper to quantum-entangled particles while maintaining the same fundamental physical principles and purpose." The window family of technologies represents one of the most enduring innovations in human history. As interplanetary tensions periodically flared between Earth and the increasingly independent Martian colonies, electronic warfare capabilities took on renewed military significance. In a classified facility beneath Olympus Mons in 2088, Martian Defense Forces developed autonomous chaff swarms that could act as both sensors and countermeasures, adapting their behavior based on the electromagnetic environment. General Darius Wright Okafor, a descendant of both Thomas Wright and Commander Adebayo Okafor, supervised the final testing phase. Born on Mars, he had never set foot on the planet where his ancestor had first deployed window, yet he continued the family tradition in this new world. The Earth forces have quantum radar arrays that can penetrate most conventional countermeasures, he explained to visiting officials. Our response isn't to try to match their sensing power directly, but to increase the complexity of the deception environment beyond what even their quantum systems can process. A demonstration showed how the autonomous swarms could create phantom fleet signatures complete with simulated communications traffic, heat signatures, and even subtle gravitational perturbations that would register on multiple sensing systems. No single countermeasure is perfect, Wright Okafor continued, but by creating sufficient layers of ambiguity across multiple sensing domains, we can ensure that any potential aggressor must verify targets through diplomatic channels before taking irreversible action. The strategy echoed the same principles that had governed the deployment of Window's descendants during Cold War confrontations on Earth a century earlier, using uncertainty as a tool for strategic stability. In 2093, as humanity marked the 150th anniversary of Window's first deployment, a unique gathering took place at the Royal Air Force Museum in London. Descendants of the original Window development team and the bomber crews who had first deployed it joined with current electronic warfare specialists, historians, and representatives from space forces across the solar system. Among the attendees was Dr. Eleanor Wright Tanaka, representing both her family's legacy and the scientific community that had continued to evolve chaff technology for new applications. In her keynote address, she reflected on Window's enduring significance. The genius of Window wasn't in its technical sophistication. It was elegant in its simplicity. Its genius lay in identifying a fundamental vulnerability in the enemy's most advanced system and exploiting it with the simplest possible means. That principle has guided electronic warfare ever since, across environments ranging from atmosphere to vacuum, from planetary defense to climate engineering. She held up a small, clear cube containing samples of every generation of chaff material, from original window to the latest programmable metamaterials. What connects these technologies isn't their composition, but their purpose, to exploit the unchangeable laws of physics to create uncertainty, where an adversary seeks certainty. After the formal proceedings, attendees viewed a holographic recreation of the first window deployment over Hamburg, based on recently discovered footage and enhanced with modern imaging techniques. For many, it provided a visceral understanding of how a seemingly simple innovation had transformed warfare overnight. An elderly veteran of the lunar conflicts of the 2060s commented to a young Space Force cadet beside him, "We used chaff clouds during the Tycho standoff to prevent Earth forces from getting target locks on our positions. Different technology, different environment, but watching this, I realized we were using exactly the same principle as those Lancaster crews." The cadet nodded. "In my tactical training, we still study the Hamburg raid as the foundational case for electronic warfare. Some principles truly are timeless." As humanity's expansion through the solar system continued into the 22nd century, the technological descendants of Window adapted to new environments and challenges. On the moons of Jupiter, where intense radiation made conventional electronics vulnerable, specialized chaff systems used passive mechanical resonators that required no power to create radar reflections, returning to the elegant simplicity of the original innovation. In the Kuiper Belt, where vast distances made light-speed communications and sensing subject to significant delays, advanced autonomous chaff systems operated independently, making decisions about when and how to deploy countermeasures without waiting for commands from distant human operators. Yet throughout these adaptations, the fundamental principle remained unchanged, exploiting the physics of electromagnetic reflection to create ambiguity and uncertainty in sensing systems. It was a principle that had proven remarkably durable across vastly different technological contexts. In a philosophical treatise published in 2115, Enduring Principles in Technological Evolution, Dr. Marcus Jung explored why certain innovations maintained their relevance while others became obsolete. Window exemplifies what we might call a fundamental innovation, one that exploits an unchangeable physical principle rather than depending on a specific technological implementation. As long as sensing systems rely on reflected electromagnetic energy, some version of Window will remain relevant. The treatise became standard reading not just for military strategists, but for innovation theorists across disciplines, who found in Window's story broader lessons about identifying and exploiting inherent vulnerabilities in complex systems. By 2143, 2 centuries after its first deployment, Window's legacy had extended far beyond its creator's imagination. Its direct technological descendants protected spacecraft throughout the solar system, managed Earth's climate, probed the composition of distant celestial bodies, and served countless other purposes, both military and civilian. At a tricentennial celebration of the Royal Air Force in that year, an exhibition titled "From Biplanes to Starships, 300 Years of Aerial Innovation" gave special prominence to the Window story. The curator, explaining the display to visitors, emphasized its significance. Few innovations can claim such direct influence across multiple centuries. What makes Window remarkable isn't just its effectiveness in its original context, but how its fundamental principle has continued to find new applications as humanity has expanded beyond Earth. A visitor, noting the family resemblance in photographs of Thomas Wright from 1943, and his descendants who continued working in electronic warfare through the generations, commented on this unusual continuity. The curator nodded. The Wright family's connection to chaff technology across 8 generations is indeed unusual. But in a broader sense, all of us working in sensing and countermeasures today are descendants of those first innovators who recognized that in the battle between radar and deception, physics itself offers opportunities for elegant solutions. As humanity moved further into the solar system and eventually beyond, the principles pioneered by Window continued to influence the development of sensing and countermeasure technologies. The specific materials evolved from aluminum foil to programmable matter to quantum-entangled particles. But the fundamental approach remained remarkably consistent, exploiting the physics of electromagnetic reflection to create ambiguity where an adversary sought certainty. In this way, a simple innovation born in the darkest days of Earth's most destructive conflict left a legacy that extended far beyond its original purpose. demonstrating how human ingenuity could transform a principle of deception into tools for exploration, protection, and eventually peace. And somewhere in the vast archives of human history, preserved across multiple worlds, the story of those first crude strips of metallized paper, deployed on a summer night in 1943 over a distant German city, continued to be studied not just as military history, but as a timeless lesson about innovation, adaptation, and the enduring power of simple solutions to complex problems. By the early 24th century, as humanity's expansion reached beyond the solar system to nearby stars, the principles first demonstrated by Window continued to find new applications in interstellar environments. The physical manifestation had evolved dramatically, but the underlying concept remained remarkably intact across nearly 4 centuries of technological development. On the colony world of Nova Terra, orbiting Tau Ceti E, Dr. Imani Wright Chandra supervised the deployment of the planet's first comprehensive defense system. As the 10th-generation descendant of Thomas Wright, she found herself continuing a family tradition that had long since transcended its terrestrial origins. Deploy the quantum field generators, she instructed her team, watching as satellites in high orbit activated systems that would create a protective shell of uncertainty around the young colony. Calibrate for detection of vessels emerging from hyperspace transit. The technology bore little physical resemblance to the aluminum strips dropped over Hamburg. These quantum field generators created carefully tuned distortions in space-time itself, causing any scanning beams directed at the planet to return confused and contradictory results. Yet the fundamental purpose remained unchanged, to prevent potential adversaries from obtaining reliable targeting information. "The field is stable," reported her assistant, Dr. Chen Wei. "Simulated scans from all known sensor technologies are showing either multiple phantom signatures or no clear returns at all." Wright Chandra nodded with satisfaction. "My ancestor used strips of metal to confuse primitive radio waves. We're using quantum field manipulation to confuse gravity wave detectors and hyperspace sensors. The technology has evolved, but the principle remains the same. Create sufficient uncertainty to prevent hostile action." The colonization of distant star systems had introduced new strategic challenges. With communication between stars limited by light speed, colonies needed autonomous defense capabilities that could operate without direct support from Earth. Advanced deception systems, evolved from Window, formed a crucial component of these defenses, buying precious time for diplomatic solutions during potential conflicts. At the Interstellar Security Conference held on Proxima Centauri b in 2347, military representatives from a dozen colony worlds gathered to discuss standardization of deception protocols. Admiral Kazuo Tanaka of the Earth Defense Force addressed the assembly. "The history of electronic warfare began with Window over Hamburg in 1943. The principles established then have proven remarkably durable across 4 centuries and multiple environments. As we expand further into the galaxy, these principles will continue to guide our approach to defense and deconfliction." The protocols established at the conference mandated that all interstellar vessels carry identification systems that could be verified through multiple channels, alongside requirements for notification before deploying any countermeasures in shared space. Like the maritime rules that had governed Earth's oceans for centuries, these regulations aimed to prevent accidental conflicts in the vast expanses between stars. Meanwhile, on Earth, the original Window technology had been enshrined in the Museum of Pivotal Innovations in London. In 2352, on the 409th anniversary of the first Window deployment, a special exhibition brought together artifacts, records, and simulations that traced the technology's evolution from metallized paper strips to quantum fields. Dr. Julian Wright Martinez, a military historian specializing in technological turning points, guided a group of students through the exhibition. What makes Window truly remarkable isn't just its effectiveness in its original context, but how it established a pattern of thinking about electronic warfare that has remained relevant for more than 4 centuries. He paused before a display showing the original operational orders for the Hamburg raid. This document represents more than just a tactical innovation. It marks a philosophical shift in how we approach technological advantage, not always by matching capabilities directly, but by identifying and exploiting inherent vulnerabilities. A student raised her hand. "Is it true that your family has been involved with Chaff technology since the very beginning?" Wright Martinez nodded. In various forms, yes. There's been at least one right working in countermeasure technology in every generation since 1943. It's become something of a family tradition, though none of us planned it that way. More a matter of inherited interest than deliberate continuity. The exhibition concluded with a section on Window Beyond Earth, documenting how the technology had evolved as humanity expanded into space and eventually to other stars. Interactive displays allowed visitors to experience the difference between the primitive radar systems, confused by the original window, and the multispectral quantum sensors, now used for interstellar navigation and defense. The 25th century. As humanity encountered other intelligent species for the first time, Window's principles found application in entirely new domains. The challenge was no longer just to confuse electromagnetic sensors, but to create uncertainty across sensory modalities that humans had never evolved to perceive. Dr. Amara Wright Okafor, stationed at the first diplomatic outpost, established with the SETI Collective, a silicon-based intelligence evolved in the depths of Tau Ceti's gas giants, led a team developing cross-species deception technologies. The work was delicate, balancing security needs with the imperative to build trust with a non-human intelligence. The SETI perceive gravitational waves as directly as we perceive light, she explained to Earth's diplomatic corps. They can sense mass distributions across vast distances with incredible precision. This gives them an inherent advantage in space combat scenarios, as they can track our ships regardless of electromagnetic stealth measures. Ambassador Elena Rodriguez frowned. And your solution? We've adapted our quantum field generators to create gravitational echoes, phantom mass signatures that the SETI cannot distinguish from actual vessels. Its window adapted to an entirely new sensory modality, but the principle remains identical: create sufficient ambiguity to force verification through other channels. The technology proved crucial during the Tau Ceti crisis of 2489, when a misunderstanding between human colonists and SETI observers nearly escalated to open conflict. Gravitational deception fields deployed around Nova Terra created sufficient uncertainty that both sides were forced to engage diplomatically, rather than risk acting on potentially false information. In the aftermath, the Wright Okafor protocols established rules for the use of sensory deception technologies in cross-species interactions, acknowledging both their potential for preventing conflict and their risk for creating mistrust. By the 26th century, as humanity and its non-human allies established a presence across multiple spiral arms of the galaxy, the principles first demonstrated by Window had become fundamental to interstellar security doctrine. Spacecraft of all sizes carried multi-spectrum deception systems designed to create uncertainty across every known sensing modality, from electromagnetic to gravitational to the exotic quantum entanglement sensors used by the methane-breathing Rigelians. Admiral Maya Wright-Chen Okafor, commanding the Orion Armed Security Fleet, reflected on this evolution during a strategic planning session in 2583. We have come full circle. The original window was deployed to protect bomber crews approaching a target. Today, our most advanced quantum deception fields serve primarily to prevent accidental conflict by ensuring no species or alliance can achieve absolute certainty about others' movements and intentions. Her Rigelian counterpart, Command Coordinator Blue Methane Rising, responded through a translation field. This concept of beneficial uncertainty has no parallel in Rigelian strategic thought before contact with humans. It has proven surprisingly effective in maintaining peace between species with radically different perceptual modalities and cultural frameworks. Wright-Chen Okafor nodded. Sometimes the most effective deterrent isn't the threat of destruction, but the assurance of uncertainty. If you cannot be certain of success, you are less likely to initiate conflict. The philosophy had extended beyond military applications to become a foundational principle in interstellar diplomacy. In negotiations between species whose sensory perceptions and cognitive processes differed radically, controlled ambiguity often proved more valuable than perfect transparency, creating space for mutual accommodation without forcing confrontation over irreconcilable differences. Dr. Zara Okafor Wright, serving as Earth's representative to the Galactic Council in 2612, articulated this principle in a landmark address. The legacy of Window teaches us that sometimes clarity is not the highest value. In an interspecies context, where perfect understanding may be biologically impossible, Managed ambiguity can be a tool for peace rather than a barrier to it. The address coincided with the establishment of deception, limitation treaties that placed boundaries on the use of sensory countermeasures, while acknowledging their stabilizing role in interspecies relations, like nuclear arms control treaties centuries earlier. These agreements sought to maintain the beneficial aspects of the technology while preventing its most destabilizing applications. On the 700th anniversary of Windows' first deployment in 2643, representatives from over 30 sapient species gathered at the Museum of Pivotal Innovations on Earth to commemorate an innovation that had shaped interstellar relations in ways its creators could never have imagined. Dr. Thomas Wright Chen Martinez Okafor, the 15th generation descendant of the original Thomas Wright, delivered the keynote address. 7 centuries ago, my ancestor participated in a desperate gamble, using strips of metallized paper to blind the most sophisticated sensing system of his era. He could not have known that this simple innovation would establish a principle that would one day help maintain peace between different forms of intelligent life across thousands of light years. A holographic simulation recreated the first window deployment over Hamburg, now remote enough in history to be viewed with scholarly detachment rather than the emotions of recent conflict. For the non-human attendees, specialized sensory translation fields conveyed the significance of the event through their native perceptual modalities. What began as a tool of war evolved into a means of preventing war. Wright Chen Martinez Okafor continued. What began as a method for creating confusion became a framework for managing the inevitable uncertainty that exists between different minds and different forms of perception. Perhaps this is the most important legacy of Window, the recognition that sometimes ambiguity itself can be a tool for peace. As humanity and its allies continued to expand across the galaxy, encountering new intelligences and new challenges, the principles pioneered by Window remained remarkably relevant. The specific technologies evolved continuously, adapting to new sensing modalities and new environments. But the fundamental approach remained consistent, exploiting the inherent limitations of any sensing system to create beneficial uncertainty. In the vast archives of the Galactic Library, the story of Window was preserved not merely as a footnote in military history, but as a case study in how a simple, tactical innovation could evolve into a philosophical principle with implications across centuries and species. It stood as a testament to humanity's particular genius for finding elegant solutions to complex problems, and for transforming the tools of conflict into instruments of stability and peace. And somewhere in those archives, preserved with special care, remained a small, unassuming strip of metallized paper, physically insignificant yet representing a concept that had shaped the destiny of multiple civilizations across 7 centuries and counting. In its elegant simplicity, it embodied a truth that transcended its origins, that sometimes the most enduring innovations are not those that overcome the laws of physics, but those that understand and exploit them in unexpected ways. As humanity's journey among the stars continued into its 8th century, the legacy of Window evolved yet again, adapting to new challenges while maintaining its essential principle. And the descendants of those who had first deployed it continued to find new applications for an idea that had proven as durable as the laws of physics themselves. As the millennia unfold, across distant stars and unimaginable civilizations, the principle of Window endures, a testament to human ingenuity born in humanity's darkest hour. What began as metallized strips of paper dropped from wooden boxes over a burning city has evolved into quantum fields spanning light years, yet the fundamental concept remains unchanged. In the vast tapestry of technological advancement, few innovations can claim such longevity or profound impact. The RAF trick that made German radar useless overnight not only changed the course of a war, but established a principle that would guide interactions between worlds and species for thousands of years to come. In the elegant simplicity of those aluminum strips lies a profound truth. Sometimes the greatest strength comes not from overwhelming force, but from creating just enough uncertainty to make peace the only rational choice. The end.